49. The continental system, Britain and Europe. Beyond the tributary states of the Grand Empire lay the countries nominally independent, joined under Napoleon in the continental system. Napoleon thought of his allies as at best subordinate partners in a common project. The Great Project was to crush Great Britain, and it was for this purpose that the continental system had been established. But the crushing of Britain became in Napoleon's mind a means to a further end, the unification and mastery of all of Europe. This, in turn, had he achieved it, would doubtless have merely opened the way to other campaigns to expand his empire. 435. Germaine de Staël was an influential leader of the liberal opposition to Napoleon's repressive cultural policies. She was forced to live in exile in Switzerland, but both her writings and the refuge of her Swiss home provided crucial support for Napoleon's critics. At the point where he stood in 1807 or 1810, the unification of continental Europe seemed a not impossible objective. He cast about for an ideology to inspire both his Grand Empire and his allies. He held out the cosmopolitan doctrines of the 18th century, spoke endlessly of the Enlightenment of the age, and urged all peoples to work with him against the medievalism, ignorance, and obscurantism by which they were surrounded. Although he disliked and even suppressed the creative work of writers such as his vehement critic Germaine de Staël, Napoleon encouraged innovative scientific research and rewarded the scientists who pursued it. Among his favored scientists, for example, he strongly supported the chemist Claude Berthollet and the mathematician Gaspard Monge, both of whom he rewarded with aristocratic titles and well-paid positions in his carefully selected French Senate. Napoleon viewed science as the essential rational foundation of modern knowledge. And while appealing to ideas of modernity or progress, he dwelt also on the grandeur of Roman times. The Roman inspiration appeared in the arts he supported and in the architecture that expressed Napoleon's conception of imperial glory. The massive empire furniture, the heroic canvases of David, the Church of the Madeleine in Paris, resembling a classical temple and called a Temple of Glory, and the Arch of Triumph in the same city 436, begun in 1806, all evoked the atmosphere of far-spreading imperial majesty and unity, in which Napoleon would have liked the peoples of Europe to live. In addition, to arouse an all-European feeling, Napoleon encouraged the latent hostility to Great Britain. The British, in winning much of the 18th century struggle for wealth and empire, had made themselves disliked in many quarters. There was much envy for Britain's commercial success, and many Europeans resented the high-handedness by which this success had been won and maintained. It was widely believed that the British were really using their sea power to win a larger permanent share of the world's seaborne commerce for themselves. Nor, in truth, was this belief mistaken. 792 Continental Unity, British Blockade, and Napoleon's Continental System. The British, in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, when they declared France and its allies in a state of blockade, did not expect either to starve them or to deprive them of necessary materials of war. Western Europe was still self-sufficient in food, and armaments were to a large extent produced locally from simple materials like iron, copper, and saltpeter. Europe required almost nothing indispensable from overseas. The chief aim of the British blockade was not, therefore, to keep imports out of enemy countries. The goal was to keep the trade in such imports out of French or European control, and thereby kill off enemy commerce and shipping. In the short run, the British sought to weaken the war-making powers of the enemy government by undermining its revenues and its navy. And in the long run, they wanted to weaken the enemy's commercial position in world markets. Economic warfare was trade warfare. The British were willing enough to have British goods pass through to Europe either by smuggling or by the mediation of neutrals. As early as 1793, the French Republicans had denounced England as the modern Carthage, a ruthless mercantile and profit-seeking power that aspired to enslave Europe to its financial and commercial system. With the wars, the British in fact obtained a monopoly over the shipment of overseas commodities into Europe. At the same time, being relatively advanced in the new techniques of industrial production, they could produce cotton cloth and certain other articles by power machinery more cheaply than other peoples of Europe. Britain thus threatened to monopolize the European market for such manufactured goods. There was much feeling against the modern Carthage, especially among the European commercial classes who were in competition with it. The upper classes were perhaps less hostile, not caring where the goods that they consumed had originated, but aristocracies and governments were 793 susceptible to the argument that Britain was a money power, a nation of shopkeepers, as Napoleon put it, which fought its wars with pounds sterling instead of blood, and was always in search of dupes in Europe. Anti-British sentiments, it was on all these feelings that Napoleon played, reiterating time and again that England was Europe's real enemy, and that Europeans would never be prosperous or economically independent until they removed the incubus of British monopoly. To prevent the flow of goods into Britain was no more the purpose of the continental system than to prevent the flow of goods into France was the purpose of the British blockade. The purpose of each was to destroy the enemy's commerce, credit, and public revenues by the destruction of its exports, and also to build up markets for their own national economies. To destroy British exports, Napoleon prohibited, by the Berlin Decree of 1806, the importation of British goods into the continent of Europe. Goods were counted as British if they came from either British or British colonial origins, even if they were brought to Europe in neutral ships as the property of neutrals. 437. The British, in response, ruled by an Order in Council of November 1807 that neutrals might enter Napoleonic ports only if they first stopped in Great Britain, where the regulations were such as to encourage their loading with British goods. The British thus tried to move their exports into enemy territory through neutral channels, which was precisely what Napoleon intended to prevent. He announced by the Milan Decree of December 1807 that any neutral vessel that had stopped at a British port or submitted to search by a British warship at sea would be confiscated upon its appearance in a continental harbor. Trade warfare. 794. With all Europe at war, virtually the only major trading neutral nation was the United States, which could now trade with neither England nor Europe except by violating the regulations of one belligerent or the other. It would thus become liable to reprisals and hence to involvement in war. President Jefferson, to avoid war, attempted a self-imposed policy of commercial isolation that proved so ruinous to American foreign trade that the United States government took steps to renew trade relations with whichever belligerent first removed its controls over neutral commerce. Napoleon offered to do so, on the condition that the United States would defend itself against the enforcement of British controls. At the same time, an expansionist party among the Americans, ambitious to annex Canada, believed that with the British Army engaged in Spain, the time was ripe to complete the War of Independence by driving Britain from the North American mainland. The result was the Anglo-American War of 1812, which brought the new American nation into the wider conflict of the Atlantic world, but had few results, except to demonstrate the inefficiency of military institutions in the new republic. The War of 1812. But Napoleon's continental system was more than a device for destroying the export trade of Great Britain. It was also a scheme for developing the economy of continental Europe, around France as its main center. The continental system, if successful, would replace the national economies with an integrated economy for the continent as a whole. It would create the commercial framework for a more unified European civilization. And it would ruin the British sea power and commercial monopoly, for a unified Europe, Napoleon thought, would itself soon take to the sea. The failure of the continental system 795, but the continental system failed. It was worse than a failure, for it caused widespread antagonism to the Napoleonic regime. The dream of a united Europe under French rule was not sufficiently attractive to inspire the necessary sacrifice, even a sacrifice more of comforts than of necessities. As Napoleon impatiently said, one would suppose that the destinies of Europe turned upon a barrel of sugar. It was true, as he and his propagandists insisted, that Britain monopolized the sale of sugar, tobacco, and other overseas goods, but people preferred to deal clandestinely with the British rather than go without them. The irrepressible desire for American commodities destroyed the continental system. British manufactures were somewhat easier than colonial goods to replace. Raw cotton was brought by land from the Middle East through the Balkans, and the cotton manufacturers of France, Saxony, Switzerland, and North Italy were stimulated by the relief from British competition. There was a great expansion of Danish woolens and German hardware. The cultivation of sugar beets to replace cane sugar spread in France, Central Europe, Holland, and even Russia. Thus, infant industries and investments were built up that, after Napoleon's fall, clamored for tariff protection. In general, the European industrial interests were well disposed toward the continental system. 438, 796 construction on the Arch of Triumph began in 1806, but it was not completed until 1836. It became a monument of French nationalism, symbolizing both the Republic and the Empire. The continuous band of bas-reliefs above the curve of the arch represented 172 French battles since Valmy in 1792. Holton Archive, Getty Images. Yet they could never adequately replace the British in supplying the market. One obstacle was transportation. Much trading between parts of the continent had always been by sea. This coastal traffic was now blocked by the British. Land routes were increasingly used, and improved roads were built through the Simplon and Mont Cenis passes in the Alps. No less than 17,000 wheeled vehicles crossed the Mont Cenis Pass in 1810. But land transport, at best, was no substitute for the sea. Without railroads, introduced some 30 years later, a purely continental modern economy could not be maintained. And transoceanic trade had in any case already shown that the political plan for a land-based commercial system would likely become a historical anachronism in modern European societies. Consequences of the continental system, 797, another obstacle was tariffs. The idea of a continental tariff union was put forward by some of his subordinates, but Napoleon never adopted it. The dependent states remained insistent on their ostensible sovereignty. Each had widened its trading area by demolishing former internal tariffs, but Europeans could not yet view their continent as a unified commercial system, and each state kept a tariff against the others. The kingdoms of Italy and Naples enjoyed no free trade with each other, nor did the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine. France remained protectionist, and when Napoleon annexed Holland and parts of Italy to France, he kept them outside the French customs. At the same time, Napoleon forbade the satellite states to raise high tariffs against France. France was his base, and he meant to favor French industry, which was much crippled by its loss of its Middle Eastern and American markets. 439, Napoleon used architecture to show that Paris was the capital of modern Europe and that his empire replicated the imperial grandeur of ancient Rome. He built this multi-columned Madeleine to be a temple of glory, but after his fall from power, it became a church, 798, Apic, retired Getty Images. Shippers, shipbuilders, and dealers in overseas goods, a powerful element of the older bourgeoisie, were ruined by the continental system. The French ports were idle and their populations were distressed and disgruntled. The same problems befell all ports of Europe where the blockade was strictly enforced. At Trieste, total annual tonnage fell from 208,000 in 1807 to 60,000 in 1812. Eastern Europe was especially hard hit. In Western Europe, there was some stimulus to new manufactures. Eastern Europe, long dependent on Western Europe for manufactured goods, could no longer obtain them from England legally, nor from France, Germany, or Bohemia because of the difficulties of land transport and the British control of the Baltic. Nor could the landowners of Prussia, Poland, and Russia market their produce. The aristocracy of Eastern Europe, which was the principal spending and importing class, had additional reason to dislike the French and to sympathize with the British. Economic stagnation. As a war measure against Britain, the continental system also failed. British trade with Europe was significantly reduced, but the loss was made up elsewhere because of British control of the sea. Exports to Latin America rose from £300,000 in 1805 to £6,300,000 in 1809. Here again, the existence of the overseas world frustrated the continental system. Despite the system, export of British cotton goods, rising on a continuous 440 tide of the rapidly developing Industrial Revolution, more than doubled in that 4 years from 1805 to 1809. And while part of the increase was due to mere inflation and rising prices, it is estimated that the annual income of the British people more than doubled in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, growing from £140,000 in 1792 to £335,000 in 79,911,184. Napoleon's continental system, in short, could never match or constrain the expanding global systems of international trade and commerce. 50. The national movements and new nationalist cultures. The resistance to Napoleon, nationalism. From the beginning, as far back as 1792, the French met with resistance as well as collaboration in the countries they occupied. There was resentment when the invading armies plundered and laid requisitions upon the occupied countries, and there was anger when local populations were required to pay tribute in men and money and to adopt policies that were dictated by representatives of the French government. Europeans began to feel that Napoleon was employing them merely as tools against England. And in all countries, including France itself, people grew tired of the peace that was no peace, the wars and rumors of war, the conscription and the taxes, the loss of lives and local liberties, the increasingly bureaucratic governments, and Napoleon's insatiable appetite for power and self-exaltation. Movements of protest and independence showed themselves within the Napoleonic imperial structure and within the dependent states. Even the emperor's proconsuls tried to gain the support of local opinion, as when Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland, tried to defend Dutch interests against Napoleon's demands, or when Murat, King of Naples, appealed to Italian sentiment to secure his own throne. Nationalism developed as a movement of resistance against the forcible internationalism of the Napoleonic Empire. Because the international system was essentially French, the nationalistic movements were anti-French, and because Napoleon was an autocrat, they were anti-autocratic. The nationalism of the period was a mixture of the conservative and the liberal. Some nationalists, predominantly conservative, insisted on the value of their own unique institutions, customs, folkways, and historical development, which they feared might be obliterated under the French and Napoleonic system. Others, or 800 indeed the same persons, insisted on more self-determination, more participation in government, more representative institutions, and more freedom for individuals against the bureaucratic interference of the state. Both conservative and liberal nationalists rose up against Napoleon, destroyed him, outlasted him, and shaped the history of the following generations. Anti-French nationalism. Nationalism was thus very complex and appeared in different countries in different ways. In England, a profound national solidarity developed as people of different social classes stood shoulder to shoulder against Boney, and ideas of reforming Parliament or tampering with historic English liberties were resolutely put aside. It is possible that the Napoleonic Wars helped England through a very difficult social crisis, for the Industrial Revolution was causing dislocation, misery, unemployment, and even revolutionary agitation among a small minority, all of which were eclipsed by the patriotic need for resistance to Bonaparte. In Spain, nationalism took the form of implacable resistance to the French armies that desolated the land. Some Spanish nationalists were liberal. A bourgeois group at Cadiz, rebelling against the French regime, proclaimed the liberal Spanish Constitution 441 of 1812, modeled on the French Constitution of 1791. But Spanish nationalism drew its greatest strength from sentiments that were counter-revolutionary, aiming to restore the clergy and the Bourbons. In Italy, the Napoleonic regime was better liked, and national feeling was less anti-French than in Spain. Commercial groups in the Italian cities generally prized the efficiency and enlightenment of French methods and often shared in the anti-clericalism of the French Revolution. The French regime, which lasted in Italy from 1796 to 1814, broke the habit of loyalty to the various duchies, oligarchic republics, papal states, and foreign dynasties by which Italy had long been ruled. Napoleon never unified Italy, but he consolidated it into only 3 parts, and the French 801 influence, brought the emerging desire for a politically united Italy within the bounds of reasonable aspiration. Among the Poles, Napoleon positively encouraged national feeling. He repeatedly told them that they might win a restored and united Poland by faithfully fighting in his cause. A few Polish nationalists, like the aging patriot Kosciuszko, never trusted Napoleon, and some others, like Czartoryski, looked rather to the Russian Tsar for a restoration of the Polish kingdom. But in general, the Poles, for their own national reasons, were exceptionally devoted to the Emperor of the French and long lamented his passing. The movement of thought in Napoleonic Germany. By far, the most momentous new national movement developed in Germany. The Germans rebelled not only against the Napoleonic rule, but also against the century-old ascendancy of French civilization. They rebelled not only against the French armies, but also against much of the philosophy of the Age of Enlightenment. The years of the French Revolution and Napoleon were for Germany the years of great cultural efflorescence, the years of Beethoven, Goethe, and Schiller, of Herder, Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Schleiermacher, and many others. German ideas fell in with all the ferment of the new cultural movement known as Romanticism, which was everywhere challenging the dry abstractions of the Age of Reason and shaping the new themes of literature, music, art, and historical research. Romanticism contributed to a growing German critique of 18th century French culture, and German influence spread into the culture and politics of other European societies. In the 19th century, the Germans came to be widely regarded as intellectual leaders, somewhat as the French had been in the century before. And many of the distinctive features of German thought were somehow connected with the broader anti-Enlightenment themes of both nationalism and Romantic philosophy. The national movement in Germany ate other too. Formerly, especially in the century following the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the Germans had been less nationally minded than other Western European peoples. They prided themselves on their world citizenship or cosmopolitan outlook. Looking out from the small states in which most Germans lived, they were conscious of Europe, conscious of other countries, but hardly conscious of Germany. The Holy Roman Empire was neither a forceful political power nor the public embodiment of a well-defined national culture. The German world had no tangible frontiers. The area of German speech simply faded out into Alsace or the Austrian Netherlands, or into Poland, Bohemia, or the Upper Balkans. Germany had not yet taken on a coherent cultural or political existence. The upper classes, becoming contemptuous of much that was German, adopted French fashions, dress, etiquette, manners, ideas, and language, regarding them as an international norm of civilized living. Frederick the Great hired French tax collectors and wrote his own books in French. 442 nationalism grew rapidly as people throughout Europe increasingly questioned and resisted Napoleon's expansionist imperial policies. This cartoon depiction of an angry fighter attacking Napoleon expresses the British pride in their successful 803 national resistance to every French plan for invading Great Britain. Henry Gutman, Getty Images. About 1780, signs of a change set in. Even Frederick, in his later years, predicted a golden age of German literature, proudly declaring that Germans could do what other nations had done. In 1784 appeared a book by J.G. Herder called Ideas on the Philosophy of the History of Mankind. Herder was a Protestant pastor and theologian who had once lived in Paris and found the French somewhat frivolous. He concluded that imitation of foreign ways made people shallow and artificial. He declared that German ways were indeed different from French, but not any less worthy of respect. All true culture or civilization, he held, must arise from native roots. It must arise also from the life of the common people, the Volk, not from the cosmopolitan and artificial life of the upper classes. Each group of people who shared the same language, Herder argued, also shared their own distinctive attitudes, spirit, or genius. A sound civilization must express its own national character or Volksgeist. Herder did not believe the nations to be in conflict. Quite the contrary, he simply insisted that they were different. He did not believe German culture to be the best. Many other peoples, notably the Slavs, would therefore find his ideas applicable to their own nationalist needs. His philosophy of history, however, was very different from that of Voltaire and the philosophes, who had expected all people to progress along the same path of reason and enlightenment toward a similar civilization. Herder thought that all 443 peoples should develop their own genius in their own way, each slowly unfolding with a kind of plant like growth, avoiding sudden change or distortion by outside influence, and all ultimately reflecting in their endless diversity the infinite richness of humanity and of God. Herder's cultural nationalism, 804, the idea of the Volksgeist, soon passed to other countries in the general movement of Romantic thought. Like much else in Romanticism, it emphasized genius or intuition rather than reason. It stressed the differences rather than the similarity of mankind. It broke down that sense of human similarity or universality that had been characteristic of the Age of Enlightenment and that revealed itself in French and American doctrines of the rights of man, or again in the law codes of Napoleon. In the past, it had been usually thought that whatever was truly good was good for all peoples. Good poetry, for example, adhered to certain classical principles or rules of composition, which were the same for all writers from the Greeks on down. Now, according to Herder and to Romantics in all countries, good poetry was the poetry that expressed an inner genius, either an individual genius or the unique genius of a people. There were no more rigid classical rules. Good and just laws, according to the older philosophy of natural law, somehow corresponded to a standard of justice that was the same for all people. But now, according to Herder and the Romantic school of jurisprudence, good laws were those that reflected local conditions or national idiosyncrasies. Here again, there were no rules, except possibly the rule that each nation should follow its own cultural path. Herder's philosophy set forth a cultural nationalism without a political message, but the French Revolution made the Germans more aware of national political questions and acutely conscious of the state. It showed what a people could do with a powerful state once they took it over and used it for their own purposes. For one thing, the French had raised themselves to the dignity of citizenship. They had become free individuals, responsible for themselves, taking part in the affairs of their country. For another, because they had a unified state that included all French people, and one in which a whole nation surged with a new sense of freedom, they were able to rise above all the other nations of Europe. Many in Germany were beginning to feel humiliation at the paternalism of their governments. The futilities of the Holy Roman Empire, which had made Germany for centuries the battlefield of Europe, now filled them with shame and indignation. They saw with disgust how their German princes, forever squabbling with each other for control over German subjects, 805 disgraced themselves before the French to promote their own interests. The national awakening in Germany, which set in strongly after 1800, was therefore directed not only against Napoleon and the French, but also against the German rulers and many of the half-Frenchified German upper classes. It was democratic in that it stressed the superior virtue of the common people. German political aspirations. Many Germans became fascinated by the idea of political and national greatness, precisely because they had neither. A great national German state, expressing the deep moral will and distinctive culture of the German people, seemed to offer solutions to both their political and cultural problems. It would give moral dignity to the individual German, solve the vexatious question of the selfish petty princes, protect the deep German Volksgeist from violation, and secure the Germans from subjection to outside powers. The nationalist philosophy remained somewhat vague because, in practice, there was little that one could do. Father Jean organized a kind of youth movement and led young men on open-air expeditions into the country, where they made fun of aristocrats in French costume. He taught them to be suspicious of foreigners, Jews, and internationalists, and indeed of everything that might corrupt the purity of the German Volk. Most 444 Germans thought him too extreme. Others collected wonderful stories of the rich medieval German past. There was an anonymous anti-French work, Germany in its Deep Humiliation, for selling which the publisher Palm was put to death. Others founded the Moral and Scientific Union, generally known as the Tugend, or League of Virtue or Manliness, whose members, by developing their own moral character, were to contribute to the future of Germany. The career of J.G. Fichte illustrates the course of German thought in these years. Fichte was a moral and metaphysical philosopher, a professor at the University of Jena. His doctrine that the inner spirit of the 806 individual creates its own moral universe was much admired in many countries. In America, for example, it entered into the transcendental philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson. During his early philosophical career, Fichte expressed little interest in a specific national feeling. He enthusiastically approved of the French Revolution, as did many other German intellectuals at the time. In 1793, with the Revolution at its height, Fichte published a laudatory tract on the French Republic. He saw it as an emancipation of the human spirit, a step upward in the elevation of human dignity and moral stature. He accepted the idea of the terror, that of forcing men to be free, and he shared Rousseau's conception of the state as the embodiment of the sovereign will of a people. He came to see the state as the means of human salvation. When the French conquered Germany, Fichte became intensely and self-consciously German. Responding to the French occupation, he took over the idea of the Volksgeist. Not only did the individual spirit create its own moral universe, but the spirit of a people created a kind of moral universe as well. Manifested in its language, history, arts, folkways, customs, institutions, and ideas. Fichte and the German national spirit. At Berlin in 1808, Fichte delivered a series of addresses to the German nation, declaring that there was an ineradicable German spirit, a primordial and immutable national character, more noble than that of other peoples, thus going beyond Herder, to be kept pure at all costs from all outside influence, either international or French. The German spirit, he held, had always been profoundly different from that of France and Western Europe. Germany had never yet really achieved the national or international stature that such a noble, creative people should attain. But Fichte confidently affirmed that the Germans would eventually play a great role in world history. The commander of the French army, then occupying the city, thought the lectures too academic to be worth 807's suppression. They attracted only small audiences, but his published lectures provided an enduring philosophical argument for German nationalism, and many Germans later regarded him as a national hero. Reforms in Prussia. Politically, the revolt against the French led to major transformations in Prussia and the Prussian state. After the death of Frederick the Great, in 1786, Prussia had fallen into a period of satisfied inertia, such as is likely to follow upon rapid growth or spectacular success. Then, in 1806, at Jena Auerstedt, the kingdom collapsed in a single battle. Its western and most of its Polish territories were taken away. It was relegated by Napoleon to its old holdings east of the Elbe River. Even here, the French remained in occupation, for Napoleon stationed his Ninth Corps in Berlin. But in the eyes of German nationalists, Prussia had a moral advantage. Of all the German states, it was the least compromised by collaboration with the French. Toward Prussia, as toward a haven, German patriots therefore made their way. Prussia, east of the Elbe, formerly the least German of German 445 lands, became the center of an all-German movement for national freedom. The German responses to French imperial expansion during the years after Jena thus increased Prussian influence throughout Germany. But neither Fichte nor Hegel, Gneisenau nor Scharnhorst, Stein nor Hardenberg, all of whom contributed to the rebuilding of Prussia and to a deepening German identity within Prussia, was a native Prussian. The main problem for Prussia was military, because Napoleon could be overthrown only by military force. And as always in Prussia, the requirements of the army strongly influenced the evolution of the state. The problem was conceived to be one of morale and personnel. The old Prussia of Frederick, which had fallen ingloriously, had been mechanical, 809, arbitrary, soulless. Its people had lacked the sense of membership in the state, and in the army its soldiers had held no hope of promotion and felt no patriotic spirit. To produce this spirit was the aim of the army reformers Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. Gneisenau was a Saxon who had served in one of the British Hessian regiments in the War of American Independence, during which he had observed the military value of patriotic feeling in the American soldiers. He was also a close observer of the consequences of the French Revolution, which, he said, had set in action the national energy of the entire French people, putting the different classes on an equal social and fiscal basis. If Prussia was to strengthen itself against France, or indeed to avoid a future revolution within Prussia itself, it must find a means to inspire similar feelings of participation among its own people, and to allow capable individuals to fill important positions in the army and government without regard to their social status. The reconstruction of the state, prerequisite to the reconstruction of the army, was initiated by Baron Stein and continued by his successor, Hardenberg. Like Metternich, 446 Stein came from Western Germany, and he was long hostile to what he considered a barely civilized Prussia, but he finally turned to the Prussian state as the best hope to lead Germany as a whole into the future. Deeply committed to the philosophy of Kant and Fichte, he emphasized the concepts of duty, service, moral character, and responsibility. He thought that the common people must be awakened to moral life and raised from a brutalized servility to the level of self-determination and membership in the community. This, he believed, required an equality more of duties than of rights. Under Stein, the old caste structure of Prussia became somewhat less rigid. Property became interchangeable between social classes, and soldiers of all classes could now serve as officers in the army. The burghers, to develop a sense of citizenship and participation in the state, were given extensive freedom of self-government in the cities. The municipal systems of Prussia, and later of Germany, became a model for much of Europe in the following century. 810, Stein's most famous work was the abolition of serfdom. It was impossible to strengthen Prussia for a war of liberation against the French by introducing radical reforms that would antagonize the Junkers who commanded the army. Stein's Ordinance of 1807 thus abolished only the hereditary subjection of peasants to their manorial lords. It gave peasants the right to move and migrate, marry, and take up trades without the lord's approval. If, however, they remained on the land, they were still subject to all the old services of forced labor in the fields of the lord. Peasants who held small plots of land as tenures from their lords continued to be liable for the old dues and fees. By an edict of 1810, they might convert this traditional tenure into their own private property, getting rid of the manorial obligations, but only on the condition that 1/3 of the land held should become the private property of the lord. In the following decades, many such conversions took place. As a result, the estates of the Junkers grew considerably larger. The reforms in Prussia gave new legal status and freedom of movement to the mass of the population, thereby laying the foundation for a modern state and modern economy. The peasants tended to become mere hired agricultural laborers, however, and the social position of the landowning Junkers was heightened, not reduced. But Prussia avoided a political revolution. Stein himself, because Napoleon feared him, was obliged to go into exile in 1808, but his reforms endured.